The Elm Ridge Animal Shelter sat at the end of an old industrial street, where the rough gray brick walls still bore the stains of time. Inside, fluorescent lights cast a pale glow on the cold concrete floor, adding to the silence that already felt heavy with sadness. The air smelled of disinfectant, mixed with the echoing barks from rows of gleaming steel cages, each bark different, eager, expectant, pleading. And amid those sounds was a silence that felt unbearably sorrowful. In the farthest corner of the kennel row, where most visitors barely glanced before moving on, sat a small cage cloaked in stillness. Inside lay an aging shepherd dog, curled into himself, fur missing in patches that revealed irritated skin, eyes half-closed and cloudy, breathing shallow as if apologizing for his existence. A hastily written sign hung on the gate. Max, male, 6 years, medical attention needed. Max didn't bark. He didn't paw at the door. He didn't wag his tail. He just lay there, like a forgotten relic among the younger, stronger, cuter hopes. He had once been a handsome dog, no doubt, with strong bones, a broad chest, and the upright ears of a classic shepherd. But all of it had been worn down by time, illness, and too many abandonments with no explanation. And right there, in a place seemingly forgotten by life, a small pair of footsteps came to a stop. Ellie Carter, 2.5 years old, with softly curled blonde hair and deep gray eyes, stood still in front of Max's cage. She didn't squeal like the other children, didn't chase the barking or tumble with fluffy puppies. She just stood there, one small hand pressed against the wire. Her eyes met Max's dim gaze for a fleeting moment, and time seemed to pause. "Doggy," Ellie whispered. A short, raspy word, but it rang out in the still air like a call stirring something long dormant. It was one of the few words Ellie had ever spoken on her own. She was delayed in speech, usually communicating through gestures and glances. Rachel Carter, Ellie's mother, followed slowly behind, her eyes still scanning the nameplates on the cages of puppies. She hadn't expected to find anything today beyond a quiet act of remembrance. Her husband, David, had once dreamed of owning a shepherd when he returned from service. Each year, since the year he left and never came back, Rachel had brought their daughter to the shelter in silent, simple tribute. "Ellie, come on now. We're just here to look," Rachel said gently. But she quickly noticed the stubborn look on her child's face. Those little feet were planted firm like roots. Ellie's eyes never left Max, and in that gaze, Rachel sensed something strange, a feeling that struck deep in her chest. She crouched down. "Do you like that doggy? But you see, he's sick. We can't get close to him." But Ellie turned her head and, more clearly than ever before, said, "Doggy sick, need help." Rachel froze. Her eyes returned to Max for the first time, not through the lens of caution or practicality, but with the heart of a mother, someone who had once been in so much pain she wanted to give up. And in that moment, she didn't just see an abandoned dog. She saw a living soul clinging to its final chance. Max lifted his head when Ellie spoke. It was small, but it was effort. His near-lifeless tail gave a faint tremble. His eyes opened just a sliver, as if recognizing something familiar. A sudden warmth surged to Rachel's throat, caught between logic and emotion. A voice called out behind her, "I wouldn't get too close. He's sick." Rachel turned to see a shelter staff member checking a clipboard. "His name's Max," they added. "We're going to reassess him tomorrow morning." The way they said it, Rachel understood instantly. Reassess meant euthanize. Ellie still stood there, hand on the cage, silent. And Max, though he couldn't stand, dragged himself slightly closer to her, inch by inch, as if to say, "I'm still here. Please don't leave me again." Rachel swallowed hard. In that fleeting moment, she felt like their lives might have just turned onto a completely new path. And she didn't know that here, in this cold space, amid echoing barks and dim light, 3 broken souls would begin to heal one another, step by step, with courage, with love, and with the kind of miracles that defy logic. Rachel stood silently in front of Max's cage, her eyes fixed on Ellie, but her mind drifting to an autumn day 3 years ago, the day her world collapsed without a sound. That day, golden sunlight bathed the porch, and Rachel was folding baby clothes in the living room when the knock came. Not loud, not rushed, but steady and patient, like a knife pressed slowly into her chest. She opened the door to find 2 soldiers in full uniform, hats held to their chests, a perfectly folded flag in their hands. They didn't have to speak. Rachel already knew. David Carter, her husband, the Marine with the warm smile and sea-blue eyes who had promised to come back from his 3rd deployment, was gone. He left behind a letter, a dog tag filled with memories, and a tiny life not yet born. Ellie was born 6 weeks early. She entered the world frail and silent, just like the unnamed grief living inside her mother. Doctors weren't sure she'd make it. Her lungs were underdeveloped, her heart faint. But Ellie clung to life with a strange tenacity, as if, somewhere deep inside, she knew her father had given everything so she could be here. In a stark white hospital room, Rachel held her daughter with trembling arms, one hand clutching the necklace etched with David's name. She whispered the lullabies he used to hum in her ear, trying to pass the last warmth of him into the tiny heart on her chest. From that moment on, Rachel knew the world was no longer safe. She stopped dreaming, stopped imagining. She lived by lists, things to buy, tasks to do, dangers to avoid. And on those lists, getting a dog always sat in the risks column. Not because she didn't love dogs, David had always wanted a shepherd named Duke, but because allergies, illness, and accidental falls were all too dangerous for a girl with a weak immune system, and a single mother counting every penny. They lived on the edge of Elmridge, in a small house with peeling gray paint and a porch that groaned in the wind. The living room was cramped, the kitchen modest. But it was a home, and Rachel had protected it with everything she had. Working long shifts at a diner, wearing the same dress to church every Sunday, all to afford Ellie's medicine, diapers, milk. And into that weary world, Max appeared. Not with a bark, not wagging a tail, but simply as a worn body lying in wait for fate. Just like Rachel had once lain beside her baby in the NICU, holding her breath for that fragile heartbeat to continue. Max's eyes, though cloudy, held something: resignation, hope, or a sorrow that mirrored the one Rachel saw in her own eyes every morning. No one at the shelter that afternoon knew Max's full story. They only knew he'd been abandoned, that his health was too far gone for anyone to take a chance. But Rachel understood. She didn't need words. She saw it in the way he turned his head slowly when Ellie called, in how he tried to inch closer despite deformed hips and wasted muscles. He knew what it meant to be forgotten. He knew what it felt like to be replaced. Just like she did. Just like Ellie, the child whose father never got to say her name. When Ellie placed her tiny hand on the cage, unafraid of the shedding fur or antiseptic smell, Rachel realized something she'd never dared admit. Sometimes, it's weakness that forges the strongest bonds. And maybe, only 2 souls who had stood at the edge, one a mother who would have given everything to keep her child alive, the other a dog abandoned by the world, could truly understand the value of a simple touch. Max didn't need affection because he was cute. He needed someone to accept him, even at his lowest. And in that moment, through Ellie's hand, he seemed to find what every living thing yearns for: one more chance. Rachel never imagined she'd stand in front of a dog about to be left behind again, especially not today, the same day 3 years ago she had once believed would be spent celebrating a warm birthday with David and their soon-to-be-born child. Every year on this date, instead of cake or candles, Rachel took Ellie to the Elmridge City Animal Shelter. Not to find joy, but to hold on to a piece of memory. David had once dreamed of owning a shepherd. He didn't mention it just once, but many times, with that soldier's grin of his, warm and full of life. A strong dog, loyal, smart, a friend who'll stay by your side no matter what. The first time Rachel heard him say it, they were lying in a hammock out back. David had his arm behind his head, dreaming aloud about a small house, a baby playing on the grass, and a dog lying nearby, eyes fixed on the child. So every year on David's birthday, Rachel brought Ellie here, not out of hope, but habit, like a quiet ritual. They'd walk down the hallway, make a small donation, pet a few sweet puppies, and go home with a feeling that was both full of loss and strangely peaceful. Rachel never thought they'd take a dog home, and never had Ellie been so determined. That day, her daughter's tiny hand had gently pulled her away from the main path, away from the rows of playful puppies drawing all the attention, and toward the dim end of the corridor, where the lights flickered and the air stood still. And there they stopped in front of Max, not because of barking, not because of any big, eager eyes begging for affection, but because of the heart-breaking silence. Max didn't plead to be saved. He didn't wag his tail to win affection. He lay there as if his very presence was just one more weight on a world already too tired. But somehow, Ellie understood. She looked at Max like she'd met him somewhere before. Not in this life, but in a place deeper than that. And Max, with what little strength he had, turned his head toward the little girl, a small motion, heavy with meaning. Rachel stood still. All the practical thoughts of a struggling single mother came crashing in. Vet bills, medication, special food. She was ready to walk away. But then Ellie whispered again, her eyes locked on Max and unblinking. "Mommy, today is Daddy's day. This is his dog." Rachel's heart skipped a beat. Yes, David had dreamed of this dog. Not Max specifically, of course, but that posture, that gaze, silent, loyal, aching from a pain yet to be healed. If David were alive, he would have knelt, reached out his hand, and said, "Hey, buddy, you're coming home with us, okay?" Rachel gripped her daughter's hand, her voice trembling like the first wind of morning. "Ellie, we came just to remember Daddy." "I remember him," Ellie whispered. "Daddy liked shepherds." The sentence was like a tiny key, unlocking the door Rachel had kept closed for so long. The memory of a man full of love, a father who never got to hold his daughter, and a dream left unfinished. All of it came flooding back, so powerfully Rachel had to turn away to hide the tear that slipped down her cheek. Max still lay there, not whining, not retreating, but his thin tail gave one more soft twitch, like a quiet answer. "If you still need me, I'm still here." Brenda, the shelter manager, stepped forward, her voice as soft as a breeze. "Max will have his final check tomorrow morning, Ms. Carter. After that, if no one comes, we have to—" She didn't finish the sentence. Rachel nodded faintly. She understood every unspoken word. Ellie didn't grasp the meaning, but she moved closer, resting her forehead gently against the wire mesh. Max touched his nose to the same spot, as if two broken hearts had found each other through a wall. Rachel sighed, kneeling beside her daughter. She didn't say, "We can't." She didn't repeat the long list of practical reasons, because in that moment, none of them were enough to say no. David once wished for a friend like Max, and maybe now, that unfinished dream had found someone ready to finish writing it. Rachel still knelt beside Ellie, her eyes wet with tears, when her daughter whispered a sentence that cracked every wall she'd spent years building. "Doggy sick? Need help?" 4 simple words. But coming from a child who spoke so rarely, so slowly, they landed like a sacred truth. Ellie had never expressed anything so clearly. And now, not for a toy, not for ice cream, but for a skeletal, motionless dog lying behind cold steel bars. The words lingered in the air like a broken melody rising from that tiny heart. And for one fragile moment, Rachel felt something sacred was happening. Max stirred beneath his old, tattered blanket. A barely there movement, but for a worn-out body, it was a monumental effort. He tilted his head very slowly, and his infected, foggy eyes locked onto Ellie's. No fear, no caution, only recognition. And Ellie? She didn't flinch, didn't blink, didn't shy away. Her tiny hand touched the metal grate, not needing explanation, not even hesitating. Her eyes met Max's not like a child seeing an animal, but like two souls who knew what loneliness tasted like, and had finally found one another. "She doesn't usually talk much," came a voice from behind. Brenda, the shelter manager. "This is the first time I've heard her say a sentence like that." Rachel nodded slightly, her heart still caught in that strange swell of emotion. She couldn't look away from what was in front of her, her daughter, offering a gesture so pure, so gentle it felt almost divine. "His name's Max," Brenda added, her voice dropping as she stepped closer, careful not to disturb the moment. "We've tried treating him, tried everything, but no one chose him, and tomorrow is the day for reassessment." The way she said reassessment sent a chill down Rachel's spine. It was the word used to avoid saying the truth. Eternal sleep for those with no second chances left. Rachel leaned in close to Ellie, gently touching her shoulder. "Sweetheart, this dog is sick. We can't help him." "I help," Ellie said. Her voice wasn't argumentative. It wasn't pleading. It was filled with a strange certainty, the kind of belief only children can still carry in a world that's grown too cold. Rachel looked into her daughter's eyes, then looked at Max, and she saw herself. On those long nights in the NICU, when Ellie still needed tubes to breathe, her heart barely beating, while doctors exchanged hesitant glances. There were times Rachel had thought, if she doesn't make it, I don't want to either. But Ellie had lived, and now Ellie wanted to save someone else. "You can tell he's sad?" Rachel asked, though her heart already knew the answer. "He's like me," Ellie whispered. The words nearly brought Rachel to her knees. Brenda sat down beside them, placing a hand on Rachel's. Her eyes were gentle. "Max has been abandoned twice. First time was as a puppy. He had a genetic hip issue, so he wasn't good enough to sell. The breeder left him until an old veteran, Mr. Holloway, came and adopted him." Rachel listened, even as part of her already knew where this was going. The story felt too close. He lived alone. Had Max for half a year, then passed away. His family didn't want to keep an old, sick dog. They brought him here. Another family adopted him briefly, but returned him after a week. Said he just lay by the door crying, refusing to eat. We think he was grieving. Rachel closed her eyes, took a deep breath. She didn't need more details. Her heart already understood. A dog thrown away for being imperfect. Loved once by someone who also knew war and wounds, then lost again, then returned, like a broken thing no one wanted, just like her, just like Ellie. Souls that had loved deeply and been left behind. Max touched his nose to the mesh again. Ellie smiled, for the first time that day, and Rachel knew that smile was the most beautiful reply a forgotten soul could ever receive. "Mommy," Ellie said softly, looking up at Rachel with David's same blue eyes. "He's waiting." And Rachel understood. She could walk away, let reason win, but she would never forget that look, never unhear that voice, and most of all, she could never teach her daughter compassion if she turned her back on it at the very moment it mattered most. She took Ellie's hand and held it tight. Her heart trembled, not from fear, but because she knew, without a doubt, a whole new chapter was beginning. Rachel still held Ellie's hand, her heart tangled in 1,000 emotions. She felt relief from being understood, yet also a tightness in her chest, a sense that she was standing on the edge of something immense and important, but didn't yet dare to step forward. As Brenda stepped away to continue her duties, a young man emerged from the quiet end of the hallway. He carried a clipboard, wore a shelter uniform jacket, and had a kind but heavy look in his eyes. His name tag read, "Jason Miller, volunteer." "You're the mother of the little girl who was just talking to Max, right?" Jason asked gently, though there was something in his tone that felt rehearsed, like he had waited for this moment. Rachel nodded. "We're just visiting. Every year. To remember my husband." Jason smiled faintly, but his gaze went to Max, who now lay still, head resting gently against the bars, eyes open but weary after his small efforts to connect earlier. "Max is one of the most unusual cases I've seen here," Jason said, sitting down and setting the clipboard aside, as if the story he was about to tell needed space to be told properly. "He first came here when he was a pup, from a commercial shepherd breeder. They only keep the perfect ones, healthy, show-quality pups they can sell for a high price. Max had a congenital hip issue, so they left him." Rachel said nothing. She looked more closely at Max. That's when she noticed the slight misalignment in his hindquarters, like he had walked many miles in silence, bearing pain without complaint. "We found him a home quickly," Jason went on. "A man named Robert Holloway, a Vietnam veteran. He lived alone, just outside of Elmridge. Called Max his teammate. They lived together for over 6 months." Jason paused, glancing toward another dog being led out from the far end of the kennels. "Until Mr. Holloway died suddenly of a stroke. His family didn't want Max. They weren't dog people, especially not for a sick, sad dog like him. So Max came back here. That time he didn't eat for 10 days. Rachel felt like she could hear a soft sigh. She didn't know if it came from Max or her aching chest. "We were relieved when another family, wealthy dog lovers, adopted him. They promised to be patient, to take good care of him. But exactly 1 week later, they brought him back. Said he cried all night, stayed by the door, didn't play, didn't respond, just lay there waiting for someone." Jason took off his glasses, wiped them slowly, then continued, his voice quieter now. "I think he's still waiting for Mr. Holloway." Rachel's throat tightened. She glanced down at Ellie. Now sitting cross-legged on the floor, her hand slipped gently through the bars, resting lightly on Max's forehead. Max didn't flinch. He leaned in, just slightly, to press closer to her tiny fingers. Jason watched the moment unfold, lips pressed tightly together, fighting back emotion. Not every dog cries when they're abandoned. But Max does. He remembers. He grieves. He waits. Waits for a hand that's kind. For someone who doesn't take him home out of pity, but because they understand his pain. Silence fell again. Only the rhythmic whir of the ceiling fan and Max's slow, fragile breathing filled the space. Rachel swallowed hard. "And if no one comes tomorrow?" Jason hesitated before answering. "Max will be taken for reassessment in the morning. He's been here too long. His health is declining. He's expensive to care for, and no one's asking." He didn't need to say more. Rachel already knew. In the world of overcrowded shelters with limited budgets, reassessment was the gentlest way of saying goodbye. He once had someone who called him teammate, and now maybe he's found another. Jason looked at Ellie, who was softly talking to Max in her halting little voice. Fragments of a story, childlike and pure, like they were old friends catching up after a long time. Rachel felt something tender stir in her heart. Perhaps the shepherd lying there wasn't just an old, unwanted dog anymore. Perhaps he was a piece of something larger. Once the dream of David, once a loyal companion to a soldier, and now looking up at the daughter of that very man with an understanding deeper than words. Jason murmured, almost to himself, "Some dogs don't just need a home. They need a reason to keep living." Jason stepped away, leaving behind a strange kind of silence. Rachel remained still, her hand loosely holding Ellie's. The shelter seemed to shrink around them, down to this one final cage at the end of the hallway, where an old soul lay not begging, not struggling, but simply waiting. Waiting for something only he knew. Rachel swallowed hard, fighting back the tightness in her throat. She turned to her daughter, ready to speak. "Let's go, Ellie." Her voice was barely more than a whisper, as if hoping her words might mask the emotion welling in her eyes. But Ellie didn't move. She stayed where she was, her rain-colored eyes locked on Max. Then she spoke, not loudly, not quickly, but with a clarity that pierced Rachel's heart. "He's sad. Please, Mommy." Rachel froze. It wasn't the plea that stopped her. It was how her daughter said it. Ellie, who usually spoke in broken words and scattered phrases, spoke this sentence fully, clearly, And more than that, she spoke with a sense of urgency that didn't sound like a child at all. It sounded old, worn, true. The words pulled Rachel back to a rainy night years ago when she'd curled up on the kitchen floor, terrified about how to be a mother alone, how to raise a premature baby. She remembered what David once told her before he deployed the final time. You don't have to be strong for everything. Just listen to your heart. It'll know what to do. Now, she heard those same words again, this time from their daughter. Rachel looked back at Max, still frail, his coat patchy with skin disease, nose dry, breath labored. But his eyes, now they were open wider, fixed on Ellie with an intensity that didn't ask for help. It recognized something, an understanding gaze, no longer waiting, but knowing. Rachel's hand trembled as she stroked Ellie's hair and whispered, "Sweetheart, he's very sick. We can't—" "Mommy," Ellie interrupted, not even turning her head. "He's waiting for me." Rachel was stunned. Her daughter was only 2 years old. How could she understand the weight of responsibility, cost, illness, or what it meant when a dog was reassessed? And yet, standing among all those impossibilities, Ellie was the only one who truly seemed to know what to do. Rachel glanced back down the hallway and called out, her voice unsure even to herself. "Brenda, could we sit with Max for a little while?" Brenda paused, surprised. Then she nodded, her expression softening. "Let me open the gate, but be gentle. He's in pain, and sometimes gets uncomfortable if touched near the inflamed areas." The latch creaked open, and Rachel felt her heart skip. What am I doing? This wasn't part of any plan. It wasn't on the checklist of a just-scraping-by single mom. It wasn't what she was supposed to do. But before she could retreat, Max moved. Not quickly, not steadily. Each step was a battle, each movement a resistance against a body too tired to go on. He didn't bark, didn't shake, didn't hesitate. He simply walked to Ellie. And Ellie, as if she had been waiting for that exact moment, opened her arms with all the gentleness a child's heart could offer. Max rested his head on her lap. Not fully, just a delicate touch, as if afraid he might hurt her. And Ellie, instead of petting or cooing, simply sat there, one hand on his head, the other stroking his shoulder, like an old friend saying without words, "I'm here now." Rachel sank beside them, her heart clenched with a strange, overwhelming mix of love, fear, and awe. She had never seen Ellie connect so deeply with anyone, not even family. But with Max, in just minutes, her daughter had opened completely. Jason returned and stood quietly at the gate, murmuring, "Miss Carter, he's never done this with anyone. Not our staff. Not the families who tried to adopt him." Rachel didn't answer. She couldn't. What she was witnessing defied logic, something so profoundly real that, had she not seen it herself, she wouldn't have believed it. "Max was a returned dog," Jason added. "He lost his faith, but now, I think he's starting to find it again." Those words, and the sight of Ellie sitting there, hand never leaving Max, her gaze full of something unshakably pure, made Rachel understand. If she walked away today, it wouldn't just be turning her back on a sick dog. It would be walking away from the first lesson her daughter had ever taught her. Sitting beside Ellie and Max in that cold, quiet room, Rachel felt as though time had stopped. The shelter's usual noise had faded. No more barking from the kennels, no more sharp scent of bleach, no worries about her job, the bills, or the weight of everything that usually crept in after sunset. All of it vanished, replaced by a single fragile moment. Small, fleeting, yet powerful enough to challenge everything she'd ever thought of as reasonable. She looked at Max, now resting his head on her daughter's lap, one ear twitching slightly whenever Ellie whispered something only their souls could understand. For the first time in what felt like forever, Rachel saw a faint light flickering in the weary eyes of that old dog. Not bright, but warm, like a candle in the winter dark, quietly burning, waiting only for someone to protect it so it could keep going. And Rachel knew. She couldn't walk away, not out of pity for Max, but because she believed he deserved to live, and because Ellie, Her sweet, barely verbal daughter had made the right choice, long before she had the words to explain it. "Jason," she called, her voice calm but strangely firm. "I want to know what would I need to do to adopt Max." Jason froze. He looked at Rachel for a long moment, as if making sure he'd heard her correctly. "Are you sure? Max needs more than just a home. He needs meds, treatment, a very expensive surgery for his hip." "I know," Rachel nodded, her hand still resting on Max's back like a silent promise. "I don't have much. I work night shifts at Baker's Diner. We live off my husband's death benefits. But if I have to sell my old car to start, I will. As long as Max still has a chance." Jason didn't speak right away. Then he nodded. "I'll call Brenda." Less than 3 minutes later, Brenda Wilson, the shelter's manager, appeared near the kennel area. Even after nearly 20 years running this facility, she couldn't hide the emotion on her face when she saw Max. The dog no one ever even glanced at, now peacefully resting his head in the lap of a 2-year-old girl. His eyes were closed, calm, as if, for the first time, the world had stopped pushing him away. "Ms. Carter," Brenda said gently, "I know this isn't easy. Max is a special case, and I don't just mean medically." She paused, voice lowering. "No one chose him. Until today." Rachel tightened her grip on Ellie's hand, the little girl still sitting quietly, one hand slowly stroking Max's back, eyes wide and focused, showing no fear. In Ellie's mind, helping Max wasn't a difficult decision. It was simply the right thing to do. "You want to adopt Max?" Brenda asked. "Yes, I don't know how I'll manage, but I won't be the next person to leave him behind," Rachel said. Her voice was soft but solid, like a stone that couldn't be moved. Brenda smiled, a rare, quiet smile, full of emotion and hope. "You wouldn't be the first person to make an irrational decision like that," she said. "But you might be the first to make it the most reasonable one." The paperwork was processed that very day. Brenda filled it out herself, waived all adoption fees, and even offered to supply Max's initial round of treatment, antibiotics, medicated shampoo, and specialty food for severe malnourishment. She also volunteered to do a home inspection that very afternoon to speed up the process, because for Max, every extra day was borrowed from death. "You don't need to prepare much," Brenda said when Rachel looked overwhelmed. "We just need to see that your home is safe and filled with love." When Rachel finally signed the adoption form, her hand trembled. Not from fear, but because she knew this was the most important decision she had made since the day David died. Not because Max was a dog, but because he was something missing from their home. A piece of Ellie's voice, a bridge between Rachel's grief and whatever future lay ahead. And now, Rachel was ready to fight. Not because she believed she'd win, but because some things are worth risking everything for. She bent down and hugged Ellie tightly, whispering like a vow, "We're taking Max home, not to save him but to walk forward together." Rachel never thought a single afternoon could feel so long. She drove Max home in her old, wheezing car, down the powdery back roads of Elmridge, under pale autumn light. In the back seat, Max curled up on a folded blanket, breathing fast, his eyes glassy. His paws trembled each time the car bounced. Ellie sat beside him, her small hands gently resting on his back as if holding him together. No one spoke. Only the engine's low rumble filled the space, and the shared focus on a frail old dog clinging to life. When they pulled up in front of their worn-down wooden house, Rachel stepped out first. She glanced up at the cracked porch, the cement steps, the lavender bushes she'd planted the fall before. Everything looked the same, but now, it all meant something more. It was no longer just shelter for 2 people. It was a haven for a soul nearly forgotten. She opened the back door and leaned down. "We're home now, buddy," she whispered, her voice rough with fatigue and feeling. Max looked up at her. His eyes were red and cloudy, but something faint shone beneath the haze, as if he still remembered what home meant, and was daring to wonder if this time he'd finally arrived. He tried to rise. His legs shook, His hips, long numbed by pain, couldn't carry him. He made it a few inches before his back legs buckled. A low whine escaped his throat. Not a complaint, but the weary sigh of a soldier too tired to keep marching. Rachel hurried to the trunk and pulled out an old picnic blanket. She folded it, slipped it under Max's belly, and lifted him the way someone carries a wounded comrade from the field. Max didn't resist. Not because he was too weak, but because he trusted her not to hurt him. 3 porch steps, just a few feet, felt like Everest. Rachel clenched her teeth and gave it everything she had. She wasn't strong. She had just come off a morning shift at Baker's Diner, skipped lunch, and her arm still throbbed from a burn the day before. But she knew, if she left Max behind, he wouldn't make it inside. In the end, powered by grit and motherly instinct, Rachel got Max into the house. Ellie was already waiting in the living room, kneeling on the rug in front of the fireplace. She was laying out a towel, carefully folding its corners like she was preparing a gift. "Bed," Ellie said softly, pointing at the warm spot in front of the hearth. Her eyes sparkled, not with excitement, but certainty, as if Max had always belonged here. Rachel laid Max down, sliding a thin pillow under his hips to relieve the pressure. She could feel it in his breath. Not pain, not exhaustion, but release. For the first time in ages, Max didn't have to brace himself. He was safe. The room fell quiet for a few seconds. Then Ellie knelt beside him, placing her hand gently on his back, where fur had thinned and skin was red and raw. She didn't press, didn't stroke, just rested her hand, as if linking their fragile heartbeats. No words, no instruction, just the pure instinct of a child born of sorrow who somehow already knew what a breaking heart needs to stay whole. Rachel sat across from them, head resting against the armrest, watching the two of them, one small, one large, sitting in silence like lifelong friends. Ellie's face softened. Her eyelids began to droop, and Max, somehow, began to close his eyes too. Later, when Rachel rose to make a light dinner and prepare Max's medicine, she came back to a sight that made her heart catch. Ellie had fallen asleep beside Max, her hand still resting on his chest, breathing slow and peaceful. Max wasn't fully asleep, but he didn't move. His eyes were half open, watchful, like he was standing guard. Every time Ellie shifted in her sleep, his tail gave the smallest twitch, a reflex, a habit. Not one anyone had taught him, but one he had chosen, as if protecting this child was now his reason to keep going. Rachel knelt and tucked them both in. Wind howled softly through the cracks of the old wooden frame, bringing the cold from winters past. But inside this room, in the arms of each other, Max had found his shelter. Ellie had found her first true friend. And Rachel, after so many long, cold seasons, had perhaps, finally, found her new beginning. The first morning waking up with Max was surreal. Rachel stepped quietly down the hallway, peering into the living room where soft morning light had begun to seep through the thin white curtains. It landed gently on the wooden floor and on the frail body of the dog lying motionless. With every breath Max took, his chest rose with visible effort, as if even survival itself was a battle that had never ended. Ellie was already awake, still in her star-print pajamas, sitting silently beside Max. She held her usual cloth book, not reading aloud, just flipping through pages and pointing to pictures, as if telling him stories in a language only the two of them could understand. Rachel gave a faint smile, a moment of rare tenderness amidst the swarm of anxieties waiting just beyond the door. But that smile quickly faded into the reality of the day. She glanced at the clock. Time for medication. She approached, holding a soft, cheese-wrapped antibiotic, an internet trick she hoped would work without force. Still, a part of her heart tensed. Sitting down, she gently called out, "Max, you need this to feel better, okay?" Max opened his eyes. Those dull, tired eyes blinked slowly. He looked at Rachel, then at Ellie. Hesitation flickered across his face, a shadow of unease. Rachel extended her hand, offering the cheese-wrapped pill. Everything happened in an instant. Max let out a low growl, not loud, not aggressive, but sharp enough to make Rachel instinctively pull back. It wasn't a threat. It was a plea. "Please don't force me. I've had enough." Rachel froze. Her heart pounded, not from fear of being bitten, but because Ellie was sitting too close. In a flash, all her worries surged. Max was a large, wounded dog, in pain, confused, and not yet fully sure of his place in this new home. She quickly turned to her daughter. "Ellie, behind me. Now, sweetheart." But Ellie didn't move. She looked at Max, not frightened, not anxious, but sad. That look made Rachel pause and breathe deeply. "Max scared," Ellie whispered. And then, with the gentlest motion, she held out her tiny hand toward her mother. "Give it to me," she said clearly. Rachel hesitated. But Ellie's eyes weren't those of a pleading child. They were the eyes of someone who had known loss, who had stood by her mother through silent months of grief, and who now wanted to be the one offering comfort. Rachel handed her the small piece of cheese, slowly. Ellie turned and crawled toward Max. No sudden moves, no rush, only calm, deliberate respect. She reached out her hand, her lips moving softly. "Good boy, Max. Medicine, for feel better." Max lifted his head. No growl, no recoil. He sniffed Ellie's fingers. Then, guided by a trust Rachel couldn't explain, he opened his mouth and gently took the cheese from her hand. Swallowed it. No fight, no fear. In that moment, Rachel felt like she was witnessing something sacred, not born of logic, but from the invisible thread that ties together two wounded hearts who've found each other. She dropped to her knees and wrapped Ellie in her arms, kissing the top of her daughter's head. "You did so well," she whispered, her voice catching. "You just saved Max, do you know that?" Ellie smiled, but said nothing. She turned back to Max, stroked his forehead, and whispered, "More later, okay?" Max closed his eyes. Not from exhaustion, but from peace. He had chosen to trust again, not because someone convinced him, but because a small soul had asked for nothing in return, except kindness. Rachel let out a long breath, her eyes falling on the remaining bottles lined up on the table, a long list of treatments ahead: anti-inflammatories, nutritional supplements, medicated skin treatments, pain relievers, and eventually the costly surgery for his hip. Each one represented a financial weight she wasn't sure she could carry. But in that moment, Rachel wasn't thinking in dollars. She was looking at Max, peacefully sleeping beside her daughter. And she knew, some battles aren't won by reason, but by a heart that refuses to give up. Max wasn't just an injured dog. He was a symbol of belief rediscovered, living proof that sometimes the gentlest miracles come from the smallest people. After Max took his first pill from Ellie's hand with such surprising gentleness, Rachel knew there was no turning back. This dog, abandoned, broken, once growling with fear, had chosen to trust a 2-year-old girl. No one forced it. No one asked. And Rachel understood something with painful clarity. When a soul places its survival in your hands, you can't be the one to drop it again. But love didn't pay for surgery. Even the basic medication to fight Max's infections and restore his nutrition was already more than what Rachel had in her bank account. She had always thought of herself as practical. A 32-year-old widow raising a child, working as a waitress at Baker's Diner, surviving on minimum wage and modest military survivor benefits. Every dollar had a purpose. Every decision had to put Ellie first. But Max had made Ellie laugh, for the first time in weeks. And Rachel couldn't ignore that. That night, after putting Ellie to bed in Max's arms, two fragile beings, now inexplicably solid together, Rachel sat down with her phone. Her hands shook as she opened the crowdfunding app. She had never asked publicly for help. She had never written words that left her so exposed. But she wrote. She told the whole story. From the day David came home in a flag-draped coffin to the first time Ellie called Max her friend. She titled the page, "Help Max Heal." She uploaded a photo. Ellie, asleep, her head resting on Max's side, her little hand laid gently across his shoulder, as if guarding him in a world that had once forgotten them both. Before she could second-guess herself, Rachel hit publish. Then she folded the phone shut, turned off the kitchen light, and sat quietly in the dark. Within hours, the digital world stirred. Notifications began to chime through the night. Familiar dings arriving one after another. An anonymous donor just gave $10. A new comment posted. Someone shared your story. By morning, with sunlight barely peeking through the window, Rachel opened her phone and froze. Nearly $300 had been raised overnight. Alongside it were hundreds of comments, some offering encouragement, others sharing their own stories. I'm a single mom too. Thank you for giving Max a second chance. My daughter also has a speech delay. Seeing Ellie with Max made me cry. Max deserves to live. Thank you for not giving up on him. But not all were kind. A woman named Carol H. wrote, "If you can't afford a dog, don't adopt one. Some children need help more than a dying animal." Another, from Henry J. 1980, read, "I know this woman. Lives on the south side of Elmridge. Dirt poor. Don't let emotion cloud logic." Rachel wasn't surprised. In a world divided by class, a poor mother taking in a sick dog was bound to strike a nerve. It forced people to confront the limits of their compassion. Then came the comment that made her pause. From Elaine Preston, wife of Richard Preston, head of a wealthy animal welfare foundation in Elmridge, known for their sprawling estate and six-figure rescue donations. Elaine wrote, publicly, "My family read your story, and we're deeply moved. We have medical resources, experience, and the space to care for a dog like Max. If Rachel Carter truly wants what's best for this dog, we hope she'll consider allowing us to take over his care." No insults, just polished sentences wrapped in gold-plated guilt, each word landing exactly where Rachel was most fragile. Was love enough without the means? She didn't need to click Elaine's profile. Everyone in Elmridge knew who they were. The Preston's dog had once been called an honorary citizen in the local paper. Rachel bit her lip and glanced toward the living room, where Ellie was coloring a crayon picture. A tall-eared dog lying beside a little blonde girl. Every so often she'd glance up and whisper something to Max, words no one else could hear. Max tilted his head. His tail moved slowly, listening. And Rachel knew. This wasn't about pride. It wasn't about proving anything. She had seen something in her daughter's eyes. A light that had been gone for so long, now rekindled by the presence of a dog everyone else had given up on. Rachel replied, beneath Elaine's comment, "Thank you, Mrs. Preston, for your kind offer. But Max doesn't need a mansion. He needs a home where people choose not to abandon each other, no matter how hard things get." Then she hit send. And this time her hands didn't tremble, because today she was no longer just a widow. She was the protector of two souls finding their way back to each other through brokenness. And she knew, there are things money can't buy, a healing born from love, the only force strong enough to stand against both judgment and despair. Just a few days after Rachel firmly rejected the Prestons' offer on the fundraising post, their sleek black SUV appeared silently in front of her house. Silent, but anything but modest. The late afternoon sun reflected off the polished paint, casting light onto the weathered wooden porch and the freshly blooming bougainvillea, still wet from the rain the night before. Rachel was watering the plants by the steps. Ellie was in the yard, trying to teach Max how to sit using a broken biscuit as a treat. As the car pulled in, Max growled low. Despite his still fragile frame and one leg that hadn't fully recovered, he stepped in front of Ellie. His patchy coat rose along his spine like the reflex of a soldier who's seen the front lines. Rachel set the watering can down gently and moved toward the porch, her body tensing as two figures emerged from the vehicle. Elaine Preston stepped out first, elegant in every detail, from the pleats of her silk skirt to the fixed social smile on her face. Beside her stood her husband, Richard Preston, eyes sharper than the glint of the luxury watch on his wrist, reflecting the slanting sun like cold steel. "Miss Carter, is it?" Richard began, his voice polite but unmistakably authoritative, the voice of a man used to giving orders and being obeyed. Rachel nodded. She neither invited them in nor stepped aside. "I'm Rachel. What can I do for you, Mr. and Mrs. Preston?" Elaine placed a hand over her chest, her gaze drifting across the yard before settling on Max, now seated protectively next to Ellie, alert but unafraid. "We're here to speak civilly about Max," she said. Rachel kept her voice steady. "I believe I was quite clear in my comment." "And we respect that," Richard interjected. "However, after further consideration, and seeing your current living conditions, we felt it was important to speak in person. Not out of suspicion, but out of responsibility." Elaine tilted her head slightly. "Max is a special case. He needs more than a home. He needs physical rehabilitation, a controlled nutritional regimen, and a vet who can monitor him closely. Do you think you can provide all of that?" Rachel gave a dry smile, not mocking, just worn. "I've never thought I could provide everything, but I can be there for him. Every day. When he curls up in pain, when no one else wants to hold him, when my daughter places her hand on his head and he sleeps peacefully. Can you buy that?" Richard sighed and reached into his coat, pulling out a thick envelope. "We're willing to support you financially. Or if continuing to care for Max becomes too much, we can offer a fair compensation." Rachel stared at the envelope as if it were something foreign, out of place in her world. "Mr. and Mrs. Preston," she said slowly, her eyes never leaving Max, who now pressed closer to Ellie, like he was guarding the most precious thing in the world. "Max is not for sale. He's not a commodity. And I'm not someone in need of pity." Elaine kept her voice smooth. "That wasn't our intention. We simply want to ensure he has the best future possible." "He already has one," Rachel said, her voice, for the first time, rising. "Right here, with Ellie, with me." At that moment, as if sensing something, Ellie turned and ran toward her mother, wrapping her arms around Rachel's leg. "Don't take Max," she said softly but clearly, staring straight at Elaine. "He's our doggy." No one spoke for a few seconds. A light breeze stirred the flowers. Max remained in place, his gaze locked on the visitors, ready to step in at any sign of threat. Richard cleared his throat, but said nothing. Elaine only nodded, her smile brittle, her tone feather-light. "I understand. I just hope you don't regret it." The SUV rolled away, leaving Rachel's quiet neighborhood like a chill wind brushing past. When the sound of the engine faded, Rachel crouched down and looked at her daughter. "You okay?" she asked, brushing Ellie's hair back. Ellie nodded, then looked at Max. "He stayed." Rachel followed her gaze. Max was still sitting there on the porch, as if he'd always belonged. "Yes," Rachel whispered. "Max stayed. And so will I. I'll keep fighting." After the tense encounter with the Prestons, the little house settled into a strange stillness. Rachel didn't bring it up again. She focused on work, on Ellie, on managing Max's healing process. Their dinners were modest, but now always included one quiet dog sitting beside the table, eyes following every spoonful as though he'd always been part of the family. But that brief peace shattered one cloudy morning, right on the porch where Ellie and Max usually played after breakfast. Rachel was hanging laundry in the yard, just a few meters from them. She could hear her daughter's giggles in the soft light, the scratch of Max's claws on the wooden floorboards, sounds that had become part of their daily rhythm, until it changed. Max let out a sudden growl, not the sound of fear or warning, but a choked, urgent rasp. Then he howled, short, sharp, piercing the still air. Rachel whipped around. Ellie was lying on the porch tiles, her small body stiff, eyes rolled back, limbs twitching in violent spasms. Max stood over her, not touching, but howling repeatedly, pawing at the boards as if to demand Rachel's attention. "Ellie!" Rachel screamed, sprinting toward her, heart freezing as she scooped her burning child into her arms. Ellie's skin was on fire, Her eyes shut tight as her seizure continued. Rachel barely managed to grab her phone, calling 911 while Max remained at her side, unmoving. When the ambulance arrived, the paramedics found a mother on her knees in the grass, clutching her daughter, while a gaunt, patchy furred dog sat beside them, unwavering, eyes locked on the faces of the two he refused to leave. At the hospital, after IV fluids and a series of tests, pediatrician Dr. Laura Jennings sat beside Rachel in the exam room. "Ellie experienced a febrile seizure," she explained gently. "It's not epilepsy, at least not from what we can tell. It's not uncommon in young children." Rachel exhaled like she'd just run a marathon barefoot. "But what's remarkable," the doctor continued, "is how quickly you caught it. If it had gone unnoticed too long, it could have led to temporary oxygen deprivation. She was helped in time." Rachel was quiet. Then she whispered, "I didn't catch it. Max did. I thought he was just reacting to a noise or chasing something. But when I turned around..." Dr. Jennings nodded, unsurprised. There have been similar reports. Some dogs can detect biochemical changes in humans before physical symptoms show, especially with seizures. There are cases where dogs alerted families minutes before it happened. Rachel stared. "You mean Max knew?" "It's possible. He reacted exactly right, not touching her but drawing adult attention. Sometimes those who've suffered the most have the sharpest instincts. Maybe Max lost someone once, and this time he wasn't going to let it happen again." Rachel lowered her eyes, blinking back tears. She remembered Max's story. Abandoned by a breeder, rescued by a veteran, then abandoned again. Left to wither in a cold metal cage, waiting for someone who never came. And now, that same dog had become a living shield for her daughter. Max wasn't saving himself. He was saving a part of Rachel's heart. Ellie. When they returned home after a night of monitoring, Ellie was still tired, but her eyes lit up at the sight of Max waiting at the door, body rising unsteadily to greet her. "Max!" she cried, tiny arms reaching. Rachel couldn't stop the tears as Max, though still weak, stepped forward, gently rested his head against Ellie's chest, and laid down beside her as if to wrap her in his presence. As if to say, "If it happens again, I'll still be here." And Rachel knew. Some things in life don't come from luck. They come from the choice of hearts that still know how to love. Max had chosen Ellie, and Ellie, with her tender little soul, had chosen Max from the very first moment, in that cold shelter where no one else had looked twice. Ever since that night when Max howled to warn of Ellie's seizure, Rachel no longer saw him as a crippled rescue. She began to sense something deeper in him, a kind of instinct, maybe even a mission, one that he had never abandoned, despite his failing body. She couldn't forget how Max had sounded that night. No barking, no panic, just one clear, conscious howl. A warning. A signal. Ellie recovered quickly. She returned to her wobbly steps on the porch, her eyes lighting up every time Max poked his head out from the living room. But Rachel had changed. Each day she watched Max more closely, not as a dog owner, but as someone trying to understand something extraordinary. Max had changed, or perhaps more accurately, he had returned to who he once was. He moved with precision, alert even when resting, his ears constantly attuned to Ellie's whereabouts. Rachel once saw him lying under Ellie's legs, his head on her knee, eyes still scanning the room. There was no doubt. Max was standing guard. Rachel began to investigate. She dug through the papers from the animal shelter and called Brenda Wilson, the manager of the shelter that had once taken Max in, to ask more about his background. Brenda hesitated, then said, "All we know is that Max lived with a war veteran, Mr. Robert Holloway. He passed away. The family didn't share much else. It's possible Mr. Holloway trained him. Or maybe Max had been trained before that." That statement stuck with Rachel. Then she started to notice. Max wasn't just alert. He had discipline. He never entered the kitchen, even when the door was wide open. He never snatched food from Ellie's hand, even though she often dropped cookies or bits of cake. He knew sit, stay, and no, even though no one had taught him since he came home. One afternoon, while Ellie was playing with building blocks on the rug, Rachel accidentally dropped a glass. It shattered across the floor. Before she could even cry out, Max bolted forward, placing himself between Ellie and the shards, gently nudging her backward before turning to look at Rachel, like he was awaiting instructions. Rachel froze, broom still in hand. Max wasn't just a dog. And he certainly wasn't a dog who needed pity. He was a soldier on duty. Every night Max slept beside Ellie's bed. Rachel had once tried closing the bedroom door to begin independent sleep training. But within minutes, Max pawed at the door. Not forcefully, not insistently. Just enough to say, "I need to be with her." That very night, Ellie had a nightmare. She cried out, calling, "Max!" through her sobs. Rachel opened the door to find Max already curled beside the bed, his head near Ellie's pillow, tail gently wagging. Rachel no longer doubted. She began keeping notes on Max's behaviors. She read everything she could about medical alert dogs, especially those capable of detecting seizures or biochemical changes in humans. Studies showed that not all dogs could do this. It required exceptional sensitivity, a deep personal bond, and often a past shaped by military discipline. When Rachel looked into Max's sharp eyes, his precise movements, and his instinct to shield Ellie like it was a matter of life and death, she knew Max had been professionally trained, maybe even a former service dog. A quiet question took shape in her mind. Who was Max before he was abandoned? And along with it came a fierce resolve. She had to find the truth, not just to understand Max, but to protect him and Ellie the right way. Because if Max truly was a medical alert dog, then everything that had happened wasn't just coincidence. It was destiny. Rachel had just begun piecing together Max's fragmented past when, one early morning, the doorbell rang earlier than usual. Ellie was still asleep, but Max shot up at the sound. Not barking, not panicked, just standing guard at the door with attention so controlled, Rachel had to rest a hand on his head to calm him. On the porch stood a woman in her early 40s, dressed in a crisp blouse, carrying a file folder. She wore a gentle smile, but her eyes were serious, holding the quiet authority of someone who hadn't come by accident. "Good morning, Ms. Carter. I'm Diane Walker from Elmridge County Child Protective Services. We've received an anonymous report expressing concern about the safety of your daughter." Though the words were spoken with calm professionalism, they hit Rachel like a stone to the chest. She swallowed hard. "Please come in," she said, trying to steady her voice as her hands trembled. Max, sensing the tension, stepped back but kept his eyes on the stranger. Inside the modest living room, Diane opened her folder and glanced around. "I'll need to ask you a few questions and assess Ellie's living environment. This is a standard procedure following a report about the appropriateness of keeping an animal in a home with a young child." Rachel felt the blood drain from her face. She already knew who was behind this. The Prestons. They had tried persuasion, then money, and now, failing that, they had turned to legal pressure. "Max is a rescued dog. He's not aggressive. If there's been a misunderstanding." Diane gently cut in. "I'm not here to make any conclusions yet. We're simply doing our job, to assess the living conditions and child safety. Think of this as a routine check." Max sat silently beside Ellie, who was now awake, hugging her pillow on the sofa. She stared at the stranger with a wary expression that mirrored Max's. He didn't budge from his spot beneath her feet, head raised following every movement Diane made. Diane approached carefully, her eyes meeting Max's. A flicker of hesitation crossed her face before she spoke. "This dog seems very bonded to your daughter." Rachel nodded slowly. "He saved her from a seizure. Max warned me before it happened. I know. He has medical alert abilities. I'm in the process of trying to confirm that." Diane took notes, nodding. "I'm not disputing that. But I still have to ask, what's your plan if Max becomes unpredictable? Do you have support when you're at work?" Rachel explained about her neighbor, Mrs. Jenkins, who watches Ellie during her shifts at the diner, about the doctor's confirmation that Ellie's health was manageable with proper monitoring, and about Max, his treatment, his progress, his gentleness with Ellie. After inspecting the entire house, from kitchen to bathroom, from medicine cabinet to Ellie's room, Diane sat down one last time. "In terms of environment and care, I have no immediate concerns," she said, pausing briefly. "But I do have to note that there is a chronically ill animal in the home, with a history of being returned to a shelter. If Max exhibits even a single uncontrollable behavior, we'll be required to reassess. I hope you understand." Rachel nodded, though her chest felt like it was being crushed. She knew this wasn't just a warning. It was a sword hanging by a thread. One mistake, one misinterpreted moment, and she could lose the most precious thing she had, Ellie. And Max, though just a dog, was now part of that legal calculation too. Diane stood, gathered her folder. "You'll receive a formal report within a week. Thank you for your cooperation." As the door closed behind her, Rachel leaned back against the worn wood and trembled. Max came to her side, gently resting his head against her leg, a silent comfort. Ellie stepped close, whispering, "Is Max scared, Mommy?" Rachel looked down at her daughter, then knelt to stroke Max's scarred, loyal head. "No, sweetheart. Max isn't scared. But I am. And now we have to be braver than ever." Outside, the wind stirred the wildflowers by the porch. But inside Rachel, a vow had solidified. No matter the threats, no matter the doubts, she would never let them take Max away, because Ellie needed him. And Max, more than anyone knew, needed Ellie too. After the tense visit from Child Protective Services, Rachel thought the storm had passed, at least for a few days. But she didn't know that the real storm was still waiting. And this time, it wouldn't come from judgment or threats. It would come from the very thing she loved most. That Thursday morning, the skies over Elmridge wept in steady sheets, as if stretching a sad song with no end. Rachel brought Max to Capital Animal Hospital for his critical hip surgery, the procedure she had pinned all her hope, money, and fragile faith on. Ellie, for the first time in weeks, had to part from Max. She waved obediently, but Rachel could see the quiet emptiness in her daughter's eyes. "Just one day, sweetheart," Rachel whispered, hugging her. "Max will be better soon, and he'll run around with you again." Mrs. Jenkins, the kind neighbor, had agreed to watch Ellie so Rachel could stay with Max throughout the hospital process. But before noon, a call turned her world to ice. "Rachel!" It was Mrs. Jenkins, her voice shaking with panic. "Ellie's not in the house. The back door's wide open. I can't find her anywhere." A tidal wave of dread closed in on Rachel's chest. "Call the police," she said immediately, bolting out of the waiting room. One thought pulsed through her head, over and over. Ellie's gone to find Max, out there, alone, back in the recovery ward, behind the sterile doors of post-op. Max, under sedation and hooked up to fluids, suddenly convulsed. His whole body stiffened, his red-rimmed eyes flickering rapidly. Then came a low, guttural whimper, one that didn't sound like pain. It sounded like a signal, a warning. All the monitors spiked. Dr. Lydia Chen, overseeing Max's pre-surgery care, rushed to his side, calling out as she examined him. "This isn't the medication. This looks like a neurological reaction to an external trigger?" The nurse stammered. "But he was resting. There's no stimulus. It's like he's responding to something happening somewhere else." Lydia froze for a beat, staring into Max's eyes. What she saw wasn't fear. It was pleading. Meanwhile, nearly 2 kilometers away, little Ellie walked alone in the freezing rain. Her blonde hair was soaked and matted against her forehead, her tiny raincoat not enough to keep her warm. She kept whispering the same words. Max alone. Max scared. She didn't know the way. But her heart, or something deeper, was guiding her toward the animal hospital. A passing car screeched to a halt at the sight of her small figure in the slippery road. The driver immediately called 911. Minutes later, police and medics arrived. Rachel reached the scene almost at the same time. Her heart broke at the sight of Ellie wrapped in a medic's arms, cold, trembling, but conscious. As Rachel gathered her daughter into her arms, she heard the little girl whisper, Max, scared. Max called me. Rachel couldn't speak. She didn't need an explanation. Max had sensed Ellie was in danger. And somehow, Ellie had heard him. Back at the hospital, Doctor. Lydia Chen had documented every irregularity in Max's reaction. When Rachel brought Ellie to Max's bedside, the exhausted dog immediately opened his eyes, lifting his head just enough to touch her tiny hand. "This isn't a coincidence anymore," Lydia said softly, watching the connection unfold. "I've worked with therapy dogs, guide dogs, but I've never seen a bond this deep, especially with a child so young." Rachel nodded, her hand resting on Max's neck. "I think Max was trained, maybe military, maybe something more." Lydia looked at her for a long moment, then spoke carefully. "If that's true, Max could be a medical alert dog, trained to detect seizures, hypoglycemia, even neurochemical changes. I want to run a specialized neurological test, if you'll allow it." Rachel held Ellie's hand tighter. The little girl leaned against her chest, drifting to sleep in the warmth of her mother's arms. And Max, though weak, thumped his tail once when Ellie's breath reached him. The answer was clear. They hadn't rescued Max. Max was holding them together with everything he had left. A cool spring breeze swept through Elmridge that morning. Max was resting at Ellie's feet, eyes half closed as if guarding her dreams. Rachel sat at the kitchen table, sorting prescriptions, while quietly checking her bank balance again. The number still far from what was needed to cover Max's full recovery. Though the fundraiser had gained traction after a local newspaper article, the costs for post-op care, physical therapy, special medications, and prescription food still kept her up at night. A knock on the door startled her. A young woman with bright eyes and a warm smile stood on the porch. "Hi, I'm Maya Collins, a reporter with WKTV. We read about your fundraiser, Help Max Heal, online, and were deeply moved. Our station would love to do a short feature on your family, if you're willing." Rachel glanced at Max, then at Ellie, who was playing with an old plastic rope, gently calling Max with her sweet, whispery voice. A part of Rachel hesitated. Media attention could be a blessing or a curse, but this wasn't just exposure. It was a ray of hope, and Max deserved hope. She nodded softly. The filming was simple. Maya didn't script or force anything. She just sat with Rachel at the kitchen table, while Ellie and Max interacted like they did every day. Two small souls, one once abandoned, the other once locked inside silence, bathed in an honest, unfiltered light. "Why did you choose Max?" Maya asked gently. Rachel looked at her hands, then spoke slowly. "Because Ellie stopped at that cage. Because she wasn't afraid of that sick, broken dog, while I hesitated. And because Max looked at her like he was saying, 'I've lost everything too.' I knew then that love was the only thing I had to give. And for Max, it was everything." The segment aired Friday night. Within hours, the fundraiser Help Max Heal exploded past $10,000, with thousands of heartfelt comments pouring in. "My daughter had seizures too. I never knew a dog could bond like that. I'm a veteran. The first dog I ever loved looked just like Max. Thank you for not giving up on him." Rachel cried as she read them. In the darkness of her life, she had lit a single candle, and never imagined the world would respond by lighting up the whole sky. But light always casts shadows. 3 days after the broadcast, Rachel received a thick legal packet from the Preston family's attorney, the same powerful family that had once tried to buy back Max. Elaine Preston, the elegant woman who once smiled from her ivory tower, now claimed Rachel lacked the financial, psychological, and environmental capacity to care for a medically complex dog. The file included an excerpt from the TV segment, annotated, "This mother admits in the video that she had no plan to adopt a sick dog. This demonstrates impulsive behavior and disregard for consequences. A creature like Max deserves better." Rachel sat frozen after reading it. Her hands trembled as she set the letter down. In the living room, Max was dozing beside Ellie. Two lives once thought unfixable, now inseparable. She closed her eyes. drew in a deep breath like she was bracing for battle. And in that moment, she understood more clearly than ever. She wasn't just fighting for a dog. She was protecting a bond no money could replace. A quiet, invisible thread of healing, woven through heartbreak, trust, and love. Rain drizzled on the wooden rooftops of Elm Ridge as Rachel stood before the mirror, adjusting the collar of her faded shirt. Her eyes were tired from sleepless nights, but there was still something flickering inside them, an unspoken belief that fragile things are still worth protecting. Ellie sat at the kitchen table eating cereal, while Max lay quietly at her feet. The surgical bandage on his hip had dried, though he still moved slowly. Despite the pain, Max never took his eyes off Ellie. Rachel knew that gaze would be her answer in court today. The hearing room at Elmridge's town hall was modest, with creaky wooden chairs and a long table draped in pale cream cloth. It wasn't a criminal courtroom, no judge in robes, no gavel striking hardwood, but the air was thick with tension. Because today, what was on the line wasn't ownership of property. It was a living bond between a girl and her dog. Across from Rachel sat the Prestons, Richard in a dark suit, Elaine with sharp features and a shimmering brooch on her lapel. Their attorney, Lewis Harding, a former prosecutor with a voice like a ticking clock, sat beside them. Harding opened. The Preston family is fully prepared to adopt Max, a dog with complex medical needs, into a home equipped with a private veterinary team, specialized diet, and expansive property. Due to an adoption oversight, Max was placed with a financially struggling single mother, living in substandard housing, alongside a child recently hospitalized for seizures. Every word landed like a polished blade. Rachel sat still, hands lightly clenched in her lap. Not out of fear, but because Max was being reduced to an asset in need of better management. When it was her turn, Rachel stood. Her voice trembled at first. But one glance at Ellie, peeking from behind the door, and the memory of Max gently licking her daughter's hand until she slept, was enough to steady her. "I know I don't have much," she said. "I wait tables. I survive off my late husband's military pension. He was a Marine. He never came home. But what I do have, I've given to Max." She held up photos of Max's recovery, vet records from Dr. Lydia Chen, immunization slips, medication lists, and images of Max curled up beside Ellie in those first nights, his eyes still fogged, but filled with something close to hope. "Max isn't just being cared for," she said. "He's loved, and he loves back, in a way no doctor can train." Dr. Lydia Chen testified next. She submitted Max's medical file and played a short clip from the day Max first alerted to Ellie's seizure. Max didn't react instinctively. He sensed it coming. We believe he was once trained medically, or developed the behavior through deep emotional bonding. Either way, that kind of connection can't be bought. It has to be earned. Then Rachel Hill, the manager at Baker's Diner, asked to speak. She told the court about Rachel, the mother who always left on time, no matter how short the shift, just to get home in time for Max's medication. She spoke of a woman who carried photos of her dog and daughter not for show, but as reminders she was still standing. "She may not be rich," Hill said, "but I've never seen anyone love an animal with more grit." Judge Clarence Morrow, silent until now, finally spoke. "The Prestons offer much. They have means, but the law looks beyond balance sheets. We look for what cannot be bought: connection, conviction, care." Then a final nod. Max will remain with the Carter family. The hearing is concluded. Rachel sat motionless for a second before tears filled her eyes, not from legal victory, but from preserving something sacred, a piece of Ellie's heart. Outside the courtroom, Rachel texted, "We get to keep Max." A minute later, a photo came in reply. Ellie wrapped around Max's neck, her cheek pressed to his ear. The caption from Mrs. Jenkins read, "She only said one thing: Max doesn't leave. He's my brave dog." The air had barely settled after the hearing when, in a quiet hallway of the animal hospital, Rachel and Ellie met a stranger, one whose eyes looked at Max not with curiosity, but with familiarity, as if he were seeing a long-lost soldier. The man was tall, with a weathered army jacket, sun-worn skin, and eyes aged by war. He approached slowly, silently, and though Max was still groggy from painkillers, he stirred. His tail tapped the floor once, weak but deliberate. "Sergeant," the man said, his voice hoarse, reverent. Rachel froze. "What did you call him?" "Sergeant. That was his name in service." He introduced himself as Captain James Holloway, grandson of Robert Holloway, the Vietnam vet who once adopted Max. James had just returned from deployment overseas and caught Rachel's story on TV. The moment Max appeared on screen, he knew. This was no ordinary dog. "He served alongside one of my men. Max wasn't just a bomb dog. He was part of a pilot program to detect seizures and neurochemical changes. I saw him warn us before a young soldier collapsed during night duty." Rachel's heart raced. Suddenly, every strange behavior of Max snapped into place. His fixed stare before Ellie's seizures, the haunting howls, the way he always blocked doorways. After a blast in Kunduz, Sargent was injured in the hip. His handler didn't survive. My grandfather adopted him through a military honors program. They had barely half a year before my grandfather passed. I didn't know the family turned him into a shelter. James's face tightened. "I was deployed. I missed the funeral. By the time I returned, he was gone. I thought I lost him forever, until today." He knelt beside Max. The dog turned his head, slowly, toward him. Recognition flickered. "You're not here to take him, are you?" Rachel asked, voice low. James shook his head. "No, I came to thank you. And to help." As Rachel recounted everything, from the shelter to the seizure, James sat in solemn silence. "That wasn't chance," he said. "Sargent was trained to respond to neurological shifts. When he bonds, he goes on duty, always, even asleep. If Ellie has a condition that needs watching, Max could be her best chance." Rachel looked at Max. Still silent. Not asleep, but content, as if someone had finally said what he'd waited to hear. "If you'll let me," James continued, "I'd like to stay involved. I can contact military veterinarians who have his original records. Maybe we can get him better care. Money's not an issue." Rachel's voice cracked. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to," James replied. "He chose your family. I'm just keeping my promise to my grandfather, to protect the last friend he ever trusted." That night, Rachel sat beside Max. Ellie curled at his side, cheek resting on his chest. James stayed nearby, watching through the window like a quiet sentry. "He used to be a soldier," James whispered, "but I've never seen him look this peaceful." Rachel smiled, brushing her fingers gently along the thin fur on Max's neck. "Because, for the first time," she said, "Max is home." It was barely dawn when Rachel awoke. She hadn't slept all night. Her mind tossed between dread and hope as the entire house fell silent under the heavy weight of uncertainty. Max curled up on the blanket next to Ellie's bed, too weak to lift his head, but his eyes, those eyes, remained locked on the little girl like a soldier standing guard on his final night. Rachel gently cradled his body, pressing her cheek against the rough, balding fur. "Hang on, buddy," she whispered. "You have to come back to her. She needs you." James arrived early to drive them to the animal hospital. Beneath a silver-gray drizzle, the three of them walked into the surgical unit as if entering a battlefield, not just to save Max's life, but to preserve a bond that had stitched their broken souls back together. The surgery was scheduled for 8 a.m. Max was sedated and lay still on the cold steel table, surrounded by monitors and survival equipment. Dr. Lydia Chen and two assisting surgeons began the procedure, replacing his right hip joint and correcting a misaligned pelvis, a serious injury left untreated for too long. Rachel waited in the lobby with James, staring at the closed white doors, her mind torn in two, half present, half with her fevered daughter at home in Mrs. Jenkins's arms. Then the phone rang. "Rachel!" Mrs. Jenkins's voice cracked with panic. "Ellie's not fully conscious. Her fever's near 103. She's calling Max in her sleep. It felt like Rachel had been punched in the chest. She didn't cry or scream. She just sat there, still and silent, as if pain had long since burned through every way to express itself. Back in the operating room, Max's vitals began to spiral. Blood pressure plummeted, heart rhythm erratic. Dr. Chen frowned. He's weaker than we expected. This immune response is abnormal. James, instinct ignited, reached into his backpack and pulled out a hard drive. This has his old military records, he said quickly, handing it to a technician. Back in Afghanistan, Sargent had a similar reaction. They used a stabilization protocol, code G29. Using the military file, Dr. Chen adjusted the IVs and medications. Specialized treatment once used in combat zones, where life and death balanced on a heartbeat, was now resurrected to pull Max back from the edge. At home, Ellie thrashed in her fever-drenched sleep, whispering, "Max hurt. Max, come back." Rachel called via video. Her voice trembled. "Max is fighting, Ellie. He knows you're waiting." And somewhere, across monitors, machines, and logic, something reached him. In recovery, Max's heart rate slowed, then steadied. Glucose levels stabilized. His battered body began to respond. "He's listening to someone," Dr. Chen whispered to herself beside the table. 3 hours later, the surgery was over. Rachel slumped into her chair, barely able to stand. James handed her a bottle of water. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Only those who had walked with loss understood the value of presence. By late afternoon, Rachel was allowed to see Max. Still unconscious, his hips and back legs bandaged, breath shallow, but he was alive. She took his calloused paw in her hand and whispered, "We did it, Max. She's waiting for you." That night, Rachel didn't leave. She slept in a cold plastic chair beside him, her hand resting on his neck, feeling the slow, stubborn pulse of a friend trying to come home. Rain still tapped gently against the windows of the recovery room. Max lay unmoving beneath blankets and wires, machines monitoring every fragile breath. The scent of antiseptic floated through the room, still as the dog's shallow breaths on the edge of life and death. Rachel walked in carrying Ellie in her arms. The little girl wrapped her arms around her mother's neck, her hair damp with sweat. Her fever hadn't fully broken, but her eyes, red, tired, lit up with something fierce when she saw Max. He lay there smaller than ever, fur shaved in patches, his back legs wrapped in gauze, a long stitched scar down his belly. But to Ellie, none of that mattered. He was still Max, the first living soul she ever truly belonged to. "She's been asking for Max non-stop," Rachel murmured, afraid to disturb the quiet air. "Wouldn't eat, wouldn't sleep, just kept saying, 'Where's Max?'" Dr. Lydia nodded and gently pulled a chair closer. "He's still reacting to meds. But if anything could bring him back now, it's her." Rachel set Ellie down gently. The girl clung to her sleeve until her eyes locked with Max's. "Max," she whispered. "One word," but it stirred the room like thunder. Without waiting, Ellie inched toward the bed. No fear, no hesitation. Just pure, unfiltered love. She lifted her hand and laid it on Max's forehead, light as morning dew on a petal. Max twitched. The monitor beeped. A long, steady tone. Not danger, but change. His heart rate climbed, slow but sure. One ear flicked. "He's responding," Lydia breathed. "Ellie, don't move. Keep your hand there." Rachel held her breath. James, who had waited silently by the door, stepped closer, his fists clenched. "Max," Ellie whispered again. "Wake up! Max, not leave!" And then, as if drawn by her voice, by some invisible thread, Max opened his eyes. Not fully, not sharply, but unmistakably. The fog in his gaze parted long enough to find her. His Ellie. Ellie burst into tears. Not the panicked kind, but the relieved kind. The kind that comes when a friend you thought you'd lost finds you again. Max couldn't speak, but his tail moved, just barely. A soft drag across the sheet, a signature of survival. "Oh my God," Rachel gasped, hand over mouth. "He hurt her." Lydia blinked. "A touch of life," she whispered. "I've read about it, but I've never seen it until now." James stepped forward and placed a hand on Rachel's shoulder. "He's a soldier," he said quietly. "Call him the right way. And a soldier never quits." Max didn't lift his head, but his eyes, now fully open, never left Ellie's face. She leaned forward, cheek to his forehead, whispering words no one else could hear. Something unexplainable had happened. Something beyond science or reason. A tether made not of flesh but of grief, trust, and a love that needed no definition. Ellie's touch wasn't just physical. It was a promise. A call from a heart that refuses to give up. That night, the staff would speak in hushed tones of the moment Max woke up, a tiny legend born in a quiet recovery room. But for Rachel, James, and Ellie, it was more than that. It was proof. Even the most shattered heart, when touched by the right hand, can find its rhythm again. Since the day Ellie, despite a high fever and exhaustion, placed her hand on Max's forehead, prompting the dog to open his eyes from a deep coma, everything in Rachel's small house seemed to change. No longer were there wary glances from neighbors, nor doubts between can and should. Max was no longer a sick, homeless dog. He had become a member, a recognized protector in the hearts of both mother and daughter. But a week later, fate tested them once more. One Saturday afternoon, while Rachel was washing dishes in the kitchen, she instinctively looked up as Max suddenly sprang up from his familiar rug, ears erect, chest heaving. He didn't bark loudly as before. This time, he let out a very soft whine, then stepped in front of Ellie, who was playing with dolls by the window. He didn't take his eyes off the girl. Max's blunt nose pressed close to Ellie's forehead as if checking something, and his eyes, though still cloudy after surgery and numerous illnesses, were sharp as a blade glinting in the sunset. Rachel abandoned the stack of plates and rushed out. "Ellie, are you okay?" She didn't get an answer. Ellie collapsed, eyes wide open and vacant, her body beginning to convulse in small waves. Max immediately lay down on the floor, his large body wrapping tightly around the small figure, his head resting on Ellie's arm as if trying to transmit something. Warmth, breath, or some instinctual signal beyond human comprehension. At Elmridge Children's Hospital, doctors quickly determined Ellie had just experienced her second febrile seizure, a mild form of epilepsy often triggered by high fever. But what puzzled the entire medical team was Max's precise and systematic response. Dr. Cynthia Brooks, a pediatric neurologist and director of research affiliated with the State University's veterinary department, personally came to see Rachel after watching the home security footage capturing Max's entire reaction. "Ms. Carter," the doctor began as they sat in the waiting room, "Max is not just an ordinary pet. What we observed in the footage wasn't a random reaction. He issued a warning before any clinical signs appeared in Ellie." Rachel was stunned. "You mean Max knew in advance?" "Exactly. He detected biochemical changes, possibly skin temperature, hormones, heart rate. These are things that some specially trained medical alert dogs, trained over many years, can do. But Max wasn't trained. He did it instinctively. A series of professional evaluations were conducted. They simulated scenarios in a medical observation room. Ellie was monitored with an EEG while Max was in the same room. In one instance, just minutes before the EEG detected mild abnormalities, Max stood up, approached Ellie, and gently licked her palm, a behavior nearly equivalent to an alert response. That was the moment of confirmation. The next day, in a small ceremony, Max was officially awarded a Special Medical Service Dog Certificate, recognizing his ability to detect early seizures in young children. This was a rare case where a once abandoned dog, who had been close to death, was acknowledged for his natural medical ability. Rachel hugged Max tightly during the certificate presentation, tears streaming uncontrollably. In front of her, Ellie beamed brightly, patting Max's head and proudly telling the nurse, "He's my Max. He helps me. James stood beside them, his hand gently resting on Rachel's shoulder, silent. That moment wasn't just a milestone on paper. It was an affirmation of all the doubts, criticisms, and hardships that the trio, a woman, a special little girl, and a dog once thought forgotten, had endured. Max was not merely a dog. He was a silent companion, a small shield protecting Ellie from the unforeseen, a second heartbeat nurturing love in the Carter household. And now, not just their hearts, but the world had acknowledged it. Early morning on the porch of the small house at the end of Cedar Street, sunlight filtered through the rustling maple trees by the window, gently illuminating the time-worn desk. Rachel Carter sat there, her hand resting lightly on a warm cup of tea, eyes following a familiar scene. Ellie sitting in the yard, softly reading a children's book with still uncertain pronunciation, and Max, the once skinny dog, now sturdy with nearly fully regrown jet-black fur, lying beside her, ears tilted toward the girl, as if listening to every word. Both had changed, but in ways the world rarely explains with logic. Their connection transcended language, surpassing all conventional understanding. Since Max was recognized as a medical service dog, and Ellie was diagnosed with mild epilepsy, the Carter family's life seemed illuminated from within. They weren't wealthier, hadn't moved to a bigger house, nor escaped evenings worrying about electricity bills and medications, but they had entered a new rhythm, gentle, steady, and surrounded by love. Rachel officially resigned from Baker's Diner after nearly 8 years on night shifts. She began working remotely as the manager and founder of the Every Dog Deserves a Chance Fund, a nonprofit organization raising funds to help sick, elderly, or forgotten dogs in shelters. Miraculously, the surrounding community, those who once only knew her as the young widow living at the end of the street, started to open up, support, and spread her mission. The fund's website received new stories daily: a depressed boy finding laughter again thanks to a 3-legged dog, an elderly man living alone finding a 4-legged companion after reading about Max and Ellie. In every thank you letter, Rachel saw herself, a small part of a revival journey, shared and continued everywhere. As for Ellie, the girl who once spoke only a few quiet words, now could tell stories. Each sentence, each word, though sometimes stumbling, shone brighter in her eyes than any describable term. "Max knows when I'm scared," Ellie once whispered to the psychologist during an assessment. "He just knows." And the doctor didn't refute it. No one questioned their special bond anymore. Max was always the first to detect when Ellie was about to have a seizure, even if it was just a slight shiver, a distant look. He never panicked, just gently pressed his head into her palm, breathing steadily, as if conveying the message, "Mom's coming. I'm here." Ellie spoke more, laughed more, drew pictures, told stories, even practiced writing by copying Max's name on every page. MAX appeared everywhere, like a talisman. The neighborhood changed too. The elderly called Max the doctor without a white coat. Children saw Max as a hero, not because he was big, but because he was always present, patient, and kind. Dr. Lydia Chen, the one who treated Max after his critical surgery, suggested including Max in a community psychological support therapy program. Twice a month, Max, Rachel, and Ellie visited the local rehabilitation center where veterans like David, Rachel's late husband, struggled with invisible nightmares. No one forced Max to do anything. He just needed to be there. And that was enough. One autumn afternoon, as the maple leaves began to turn and a gentle breeze drifted across the Carter family's porch, James Holloway, the soldier who once recognized Max as the sergeant from years ago, pulled his car over by the curb. He no longer came as a stranger or a bearer of the past. He came as family. "Someone wrote asking if Max could visit a school to talk with the students," James said, placing a letter on the table. "He's being seen as a symbol of inspiration." Rachel smiled, her eyes misty. Max, the dog who was once abandoned, broken, and nearly lost in silence, was not only alive now, he was helping others learn how to keep living. One day, Ellie climbed up on the sofa, wrapped her arms tightly around Max, and whispered something into his ear that left Rachel speechless. When she asked what her daughter had said, Ellie just smiled. "I thanked Max for not choosing anyone else." Rachel turned away, but couldn't hide her glistening eyes. She knew her daughter wasn't just speaking to a dog. She was speaking on behalf of herself and of David to the friend who had walked into their lives like a miracle no one saw coming. That afternoon, as the last light of day slanted through the misted living room window, Rachel was sorting through old cardboard boxes kept since David was alive. Ellie lay on the floor with Max, holding a new picture book from the school fair, softly reading while gently stroking the fur regrowing on Max's neck, now smooth and warm. The house felt unusually peaceful. For the first time in years, Rachel felt whole, needing nothing more, lacking nothing less. A gentle knock came at the door. It was James. He didn't carry a med kit or documents as usual. Today, in his hands was a slim file, carefully wrapped in a weathered folder yellowed with age. "I think you should see this," James said quietly, eyes hesitant but deep. "I found it among my grandfather's things. From the Afghanistan campaign, 2014. Rachel accepted the folder and opened it. A photo slipped into her lap. It was a black and white image, slightly blurred but still clear enough to see two figures. A young soldier in uniform, his hair tousled by the wind, eyes bright, and a smile so natural it made Rachel's heart catch. Beside him stood a large German shepherd, upright and composed, with a dark gray coat and eyes that looked like they were listening to every breath. Rachel froze. "David," she whispered. "Yes. David worked with my grandfather during a joint campaign," James explained. "He wasn't in the same unit, but they saw each other often, especially during the military dog training programs. My grandfather said David had a particular interest in a shepherd, named Sergeant at the time." Rachel stared into the dog's eyes in the photo. There was no mistaking it. That expression, that noble presence, so full of emotion. It was Max. "David once wrote in his journal," James continued, "that if he survived, he wanted to adopt a shepherd like Sergeant, loyal, intelligent, and more understanding than most people." Rachel choked up. Bits of memory started linking together. David rubbing her belly, dreaming of a small home with a four-legged friend. Journal entries she had once dismissed as distant dreams, impossible in a life left unfinished. And now, the dog David once longed for, called his shadow in arms, was lying in their home, not as a dream, but as a true part of the family. "Max was a military dog," James went on, "trained to detect seizures and explosives. After losing his handler, he was honorably discharged. My grandfather adopted him as a promise to David, that if it couldn't be David, it would be someone who would keep that promise." Rachel's hands dropped to her sides, her eyes locked on Max, who now gently lifted his head and looked at her, gaze soft and knowing. And then Max ended up at Elmridge Shelter, like the last red thread connecting two worlds. Ellie saw it before I did. I was just the one who closed the loop. James pulled out one more item, a scanned journal page, David's handwriting rushed and jagged. "One day, I'll have a daughter with your eyes, and a dog who understands her heart like his own." Rachel wept. Max didn't come into their lives by chance. He was the final piece of a promise, of an unfinished dream. And Ellie, with her father's eyes and a heart still tender but profound, had called that promise home. The next day, they took Max to the Elmridge Veterans Cemetery, where David was laid to rest. Ellie wore a small white floral dress, carrying a bunch of wild daisies. Max walked slowly beside her, ears high, eyes fixed on the engraved stones. In front of David's grave, Max didn't bark. He sat down, bowed his head, then gently leaned his body against the headstone as if to say, "I've come home." Ellie quietly laid the flowers at the base of the grave, whispering into the wind, "Daddy, this is Max. He's yours and mine." Rachel stood behind them, speechless. One hand gripped James's, the other rested on Ellie's shoulder. This family, broken, never quite whole, was now complete. Max had closed the circle, not with barking, not with obedience, but with silent love, stretching through time, war, loss, and death. After all the trials they had endured, on a bright November morning, Elmridge National Cemetery, where David Carter rested, was more crowded than ever. Golden maple leaves lined the road to the memorial. Footsteps blended with the soft autumn breeze. The air wasn't heavy like at funerals, but hushed, like a whispered thank you to the souls who served. Max, now fully recovered, with a thick, clean coat, walked steadily beside Rachel, James, and Ellie. A purple ribbon wrapped around his neck carried a small medal, its meaning far greater than its size. The Purple Heart, awarded by local government at the nomination of the Veterans Association, honored not only his military service, but his role in healing a family. A memorial beside David's grave was decorated with olive branches and an embroidery of Max next to a small American flag. As the announcer explained why Max was receiving the medal, sharing stories from Afghanistan, how he saved a boy named Caleb, and the journey that brought him to Ellie, the crowd fell silent. Some cried. People who once doubted a sick, aging dog could ever matter. Rachel stood in a simple black dress, didn't speak long. She turned to Max, gently placed a hand over his chest, then looked at the crowd. "Today I'm not just here to accept a medal. I'm here to thank a friend, a silent hero, and a part of my family. Max doesn't need words. He always knows what to do, and does it with his whole heart." Ellie, in a white dress embroidered with a little dog at the hem, shakily walked forward. She didn't look at the crowd. She walked straight to her father's grave. She knelt, placed a white daisy on the stone carved with David Carter, then turned back and laid her hand gently on Max's head. "Daddy, this is Max. He helps me be brave." That small voice rippled like wind through the crowd. It wasn't just an introduction. It was a continuation. A father who dreamed of having a dog to raise the daughter he never met, now saw it come true. A mother once afraid of being hurt, now brave enough to love without condition. And a dog once abandoned, now standing among awe and reverence. James Holloway, the soldier who once fought beside Max, now a new member of the family, stepped forward and handed Rachel an old journal of David's found in military archives. The last page bore shaky pencil writing. "If I don't make it back, I hope Ellie meets a friend like Max. Nothing better than a loyal soul to teach your child how to love." Rachel cried, not from pain, not from grief, but with tears of closure, of a circle finally complete, of a heart finally whole. After that ceremony, the Carter-Holloway family began a new chapter. James left the military and stayed in Elmridge to co-run Every Dog Deserves a Chance with Rachel, no longer just a charity, but a full-fledged training center for service dogs for children with special needs. Max became an honorary instructor at therapy sessions, often lying beside kids during treatment, his gaze or gentle touch enough to calm them. Ellie, now speaking fluently, became the storyteller in short fundraising videos. She always began with the same line, "This is Max. He's not just my dog, he's my miracle." Every Veterans Day, they returned to the cemetery. Rachel brought white daisies, James walked Max on a red leash, and Ellie, taller now, hair longer, always carried the first photo she took with Max at the shelter. They remembered David. They remembered the miracle that was real. A dog who never gave up, a mother who never quit, a soldier who found purpose again, and a little girl who once trembled, but now stood as a symbol of hope. Max wasn't a miracle. He was the choice of courage, a reminder that things thought lost may simply be waiting to be found. In a child's eyes, a mother's heart, or the last breath of a loyal dog. The story of Max, Ellie, and Rachel is not just about healing a sick dog, but proof of the power of connection, compassion, and the extraordinary that happens when we refuse to turn away from weakness. From a cold animal shelter to a solemn field of white flags, Max walked through what seemed like dead ends, only to find home. A place not just to survive, but to be loved, trusted, and be himself. A 2-year-old girl, a single mother, a soldier, and a dog the world forgot. Together they built the kind of family we all long for. And you? Have you ever met a Max in your life? A lost soul who changed you in ways you never expected? Share your story in the comments below, because maybe your experience will be the light for someone still in the dark. If this story touched your heart, please like, share, and subscribe so we can continue bringing more inspiring stories of human-animal love, where every hug, every look, every step can rewrite fate. Thank you for staying until the end of this journey. See you in the next one, where hope always begins with one small act of kindness.